Some men would rather lose everything than shake a black man's hand. The sentence floated through the boardroom like smoke, quiet but impossible to ignore. Rain pressed softly against the 42nd floor windows of Whitmore Dynamics Tower, while Manhattan disappeared behind sheets of gray water and cold light. Inside the conference room, the air smelled faintly of espresso, leather chairs, and expensive cologne. 12 executives sat around the polished black marble table, their laptops glowing pale blue beneath the chandelier reflections. Then the elevator doors opened. Elijah Brooks stepped into the room wearing a charcoal suit with no visible designer label, no flashy watch, no security team trailing behind him. Just a slim black folder tucked beneath one arm and calm eyes that seemed almost too steady for Wall Street. A young assistant glanced up from her tablet. "Mr. Brooks is here," she announced softly. Richard Whitmore didn't stand. The white-haired CEO remained seated at the far end of the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin. His company logo glowed behind him on the massive digital screen, though even from across the room, the cracks beneath the polished image were beginning to show. Whitmore Dynamics had burned through nearly $70 million in 6 months. Their stock was sliding. Payroll reserves were shrinking. And by Monday morning, if the emergency funding deal failed, the company would be finished. Elijah walked forward anyway. Calm. Measured. The kind of calm built from surviving rooms that never expected him to belong in them. "Elijah Brooks," he said evenly, extending his hand across the table. "Good to finally meet you, Mr. Whitmore." For half a second, nobody moved. Richard's eyes drifted downward toward Elijah's hand. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned past him and reached toward another executive instead. "Gentlemen," Richard said with a thin smile, "let's begin. We're already behind schedule." A few nervous chuckles scattered across the room like broken glass. One board member lowered his eyes into his coffee cup. Another pretended to check emails. But the silence that followed felt heavier than embarrassment. Elijah's hand remained suspended in the cold air for just a moment longer before he lowered it without a word. No anger crossed his face. No reaction at all. That somehow made it worse. Claire Whitmore, the company's CFO and Richard's younger sister, noticed it immediately. The stillness in Elijah's posture. The dignity. Most people in that room would have tried to laugh it off or overcompensate. Elijah simply pulled out a chair and sat down quietly near the end of the table. Rainwater crawled slowly down the glass behind him, blurring the skyline into streaks of silver and charcoal. Richard tapped a remote, bringing financial projections onto the giant screen. As everyone knows, he began confidently. Whitmore Dynamics is positioned for explosive third-quarter growth once the capital infusion clears. Elijah said nothing. He opened his folder carefully and began reviewing the documents in front of him while executives talked over one another about market confidence, acquisition timelines, and investor optimism. But beneath the polished language, panic leaked through every sentence. Claire could hear it. The company had 6 weeks of liquidity left. Maybe less. Richard kept talking anyway, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "Once funding is finalized," he said, "we'll dominate the AI logistics sector before the end of the fiscal year." Elijah finally looked up. His eyes moved across the room slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if measuring every person sitting there. Then he asked one quiet question. "If the projections are real," he said calmly, "why did your lead investors quietly exit last month?" The room froze. The question hung over the boardroom like a crack spreading through glass. Nobody answered. The soft hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded too loud against the silence. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly in his leather chair, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Lead investors adjust positions all the time," he said smoothly. "That is called strategy, Mr. Brooks." Elijah nodded once as though accepting the explanation, but his fingers remained resting lightly on the folder in front of him. Calm. Unmoved. Across the table, Claire Whitmore glanced toward the financial projections glowing on the screen. She had spent the last 3 months trying to hold the company together while Richard kept promising miracles to the board and the media. Every meeting felt more desperate than the last. Every spreadsheet required another layer of optimism painted over numbers that were quietly bleeding underneath. Yet somehow this stranger had identified the exact pressure point within 10 minutes of entering the room. Richard cleared his throat. "As I was saying, once the funding clears, expansion into the Midwest distribution corridor puts us ahead of every competitor in the sector. Elijah tilted his head slightly. Assuming the funding clears, he replied softly. Another silence. This one sharper. Daniel Reyes, the youngest analyst in the room, lowered his pen onto the table and looked carefully at Elijah for the first time. He had expected another consultant, another polished outsider trying to sound important. But there was something unsettling about the man's composure. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was studying them. Richard folded his hands together tightly. I understand you were invited here as an observer, he said. But operational decisions are handled internally. Elijah's expression did not change. Rain slid down the towering windows behind him in silver streams, while distant thunder rolled somewhere over the Hudson River. Interesting, Elijah said quietly. Because according to these numbers, internal decisions are exactly what created the problem. A nervous shift passed around the room. Claire slowly turned toward her laptop again, her stomach tightening. Richard's jaw flexed. Excuse me. Elijah opened the folder at last. Inside were printed reports marked confidential, acquisition summaries, debt exposure forecasts, and liquidity assessments that should not have been accessible outside executive leadership. Claire's heartbeat stumbled. She recognized the formatting immediately. Internal board files. Richard noticed her reaction. Where exactly did you get those? He asked sharply. Elijah looked up. Public confidence disappears long before bankruptcy does, he answered calmly. People just stop admitting it out loud. The chandelier light reflected softly across the polished marble table while nobody spoke. Daniel swallowed hard. Claire's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she quietly opened the restricted investor database. Her breath slowed. One by one, the names of former institutional partners appeared on her screen. Most had reduced positions weeks ago. Some had disappeared entirely. Then she saw another file attached to the emergency funding package. Her cursor stopped moving. Brooks Capital Holdings. The letters sat there in cold blue text against the white screen. Her face lost color instantly. Richard was still speaking, unaware. Whitmore Dynamics has survived every market downturn thrown at it over the last 20 years, he declared. We are not some unstable startup begging for scraps. Elijah finally leaned back in his chair. The city lights reflected faintly in his eyes now as evening settled over Manhattan. No, he said softly. You are a company surviving on borrowed time and borrowed respect. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Claire slowly looked up from the screen toward Elijah. For the first time since the meeting began, she understood exactly who was sitting in that room. Richard Whitmore stared across the boardroom as if the answer sitting in front of him offended his entire understanding of the world. The rain outside had softened now, but the gray evening light pressing through the windows made every face in the room look pale and tired. Claire slowly closed her laptop halfway, hiding the screen from the others while her mind raced through the implications. Brooks Capital Holdings was not just another investment firm. It was the investment firm. Quiet, selective, ruthlessly careful. They never entered collapsing companies unless they believed they could own the future afterward. And somehow her brother had spent the entire meeting treating the man behind it like unwanted staff. Richard leaned forward, fingers tightening around the edge of the marble table. You expect us to believe you are representing Brooks Capital? He asked, his voice colder now. Elijah did not answer immediately. He simply slid a black card across the table with 2 fingers. Matte finish. No logo on the front. Just a silver name embossed near the bottom. Elijah Brooks, founder and managing partner. Daniel picked it up carefully, then handed it toward Richard. Nobody breathed. Richard glanced down at the card for less than a second before placing it back on the table, as if refusing to give it importance would somehow change reality. Even if that is true, he said, this company does not negotiate under intimidation. Elijah gave a small nod. Then it is fortunate I came here offering partnership. The words settled heavily into the room. Claire could hear the distant sound of sirens somewhere below the tower, muffled beneath the storm and 42 floors of glass and steel. Richard stood up suddenly and walked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. The skyline shimmered beneath the rain like fractured gold. Do you know what I built here? He asked quietly, keeping his back turned. 23 years ago, this company started in a rented office smaller than this conference room. Elijah watched him silently. I know exactly what you built, he replied. That is why I was willing to save it. Richard turned sharply. Save it. A bitter laugh escaped him. Whitmore Dynamics does not need saving from people looking to exploit temporary weakness. Claire finally spoke, her voice low and careful. Richard. He ignored her. You walk in here, he continued. Question my leadership, insult my company, and expect gratitude? Elijah folded his hands calmly. No. I expected professionalism. The sentence landed harder than the earlier silence. Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair, while another executive quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Nobody wanted to look directly at Richard anymore. The room had changed. Power had shifted so quietly that most of them had not noticed until it was already happening. Claire reopened her laptop slowly. Her eyes scanned deeper into the funding documents attached to the deal. Then her stomach tightened again. There was only one signature line left incomplete on the entire emergency agreement. Elijah's. She looked up carefully. The transfer has not gone through yet, she said softly. Richard turned toward her immediately. What? Claire swallowed. The $200 million is still pending authorization. A silence colder than before settled over the boardroom. Outside, lightning flickered faintly beyond the clouds, illuminating the wet glass for half a second. Elijah reached into his folder once more and removed a single unsigned document. I was prepared to finalize everything tonight, he said calmly, until I walked into this room. Richard's face darkened. You are seriously willing to sabotage thousands of employees because of a misunderstanding? Elijah looked directly at him for the first time since the handshake. His expression remained calm, but there was something wounded beneath it now. Old disappointment. Old exhaustion. No, Mr. Whitmore, he said quietly. What threatens your company is not one moment. It is the kind of character capable of creating that moment in the first place. The temperature inside the boardroom seemed to drop after Elijah finished speaking. Nobody reached for coffee anymore. Nobody checked their phones. The earlier confidence that had filled the room was gone now, replaced by the quiet panic of people realizing they had watched a disaster unfold in real time. Richard Whitmore stood motionless near the windows, his reflection blurred against the rain-dark skyline behind him. For years he had controlled every room he entered with certainty alone. Investors trusted him because he sounded fearless. Employees followed him because he never allowed hesitation to show. But now even his silence looked unstable. Claire slowly pushed her chair back from the table. Richard, she said carefully, we need to pause this meeting. He turned sharply toward her. No, his voice cut through the room too fast, too loud. A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. Richard straightened his tie and forced another smile onto his face, though it looked thinner than before. Whitmore Dynamics is not dependent on one investor. Elijah remained seated calmly. That would be reassuring, he said softly. If your remaining investors had not already started preparing exit strategies. Claire looked back down at her screen. More notifications were appearing now. Internal alerts. Analysts requesting emergency reviews. Questions from legal. Questions from lenders. The market always sensed fear before companies admitted it themselves. Daniel quietly watched Elijah from across the table. There was no satisfaction on the man's face. No arrogance. If anything, he looked tired. Like someone who had spent years walking into rooms where people decided who he was before hearing him speak. Richard stepped back toward the table slowly. Let me make something clear, he said, staring directly at Elijah now. This company earned its place in the market long before Brooks Capital existed. Elijah nodded once, and it could have remained there. Richard's jaw tightened. You think this is personal? Elijah looked at the unsigned funding authorization resting between them beneath the chandelier light. I think respect reveals itself in small moments long before contracts are signed. Nobody moved. The soft tapping of rain against the glass sounded almost delicate now. Claire folded her hands together tightly. Memories were beginning to connect in her mind. The ignored handshake. The assumptions. The jokes muttered beneath executive breath. Richard had not seen Elijah as a decision-maker when he entered the room. He had seen a black man in a modest suit and decided he belonged beneath him. The realization made her stomach twist. Richard exhaled sharply and sat down again, though the movement lacked his earlier confidence. Fine, he said coldly. What exactly do you want? Elijah studied him quietly for a moment. Then he answered with complete calm. An answer to one question. Richard frowned. What question? Elijah's eyes did not leave his. If I looked different when I walked into this room today, he said softly, would you have treated me the same way? The silence afterward felt endless. One executive slowly removed his glasses again. Another stared down at the polished marble table, as if unable to look up. Claire closed her eyes briefly because she already knew the answer. Richard laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. Do not play that game with me, he snapped. This has nothing to do with race. Elijah did not react. Then why refuse the handshake? Richard opened his mouth immediately, but no words came out. The room watched him struggle for an explanation that sounded believable even to himself. Outside, lightning flickered faintly over Manhattan again, illuminating the boardroom in cold white light for half a second. Elijah finally stood from his chair. Slow, composed. He picked up the unsigned authorization form carefully and slipped it back into his folder. The sound of paper sliding against leather echoed louder than it should have. Claire's heartbeat sank instantly. Richard noticed the movement too. What are you doing? He asked quietly now. Elijah looked toward the windows for a moment, watching rain slide down the glass like fading silver lines. Then he turned back toward the room. Protecting my investment philosophy, he said calmly. I do not build futures with people who cannot recognize humanity standing directly in front of them. The boardroom stayed silent after Elijah spoke, but it was no longer the silence of power. It was the silence that comes moments before something breaks. Richard Whitmore stood frozen beside the marble table while the city lights outside flickered through the rain behind him. For years he had built his reputation on certainty, on controlling conversations before anyone else could shape them. But now every executive in the room was watching him differently. Not as a leader, as a liability. Claire noticed it first in their eyes. Fear, calculation, distance. Daniel Reyes quietly refreshed the market feed on his tablet beneath the table. Whitmore Dynamics stock had already dipped another 4% during the meeting alone. Rumors moved fast in Manhattan, faster than truth sometimes. Elijah slipped his folder beneath his arm again, calm as ever, and reached for the chair behind him as though preparing to leave. That movement finally shattered Richard's composure. You walk out that door, he said sharply, and you destroy 8,000 jobs. Elijah paused. The chandelier light reflected softly across the polished black surface of the table while rain tapped against the glass in slow, uneven rhythms. He turned back carefully. No, he answered quietly. Your decisions brought this company here long before I arrived. Richard stepped forward now, desperation beginning to crack through the smooth executive polish he wore like armor. You cannot punish an entire company because you felt insulted. Elijah's eyes remained steady. Do you know what is exhausting, Mr. Whitmore? He asked softly. Walking into rooms where people decide your worth before you speak a single word. Nobody interrupted him. Even the air in the room felt still. Elijah continued slowly, his voice calm enough to force everyone to listen. You looked at me and saw someone beneath you. Not because of my experience. Not because of my work. Because of what you assumed a black man in this room was allowed to be. Claire lowered her eyes toward the table. Richard opened his mouth immediately. That is not true. Then why did you not shake my hand? Elijah asked again. Richard's answer never came. The silence afterward stretched painfully across the room. Daniel looked down at his tablet again as another alert flashed red across the screen. Investor confidence slipping. Trading volatility increasing. Someone else in the room quietly muttered a curse beneath their breath. Elijah noticed the reactions instantly. The market always senses character problems before leadership does, he said. Richard laughed bitterly, but the sound carried no confidence anymore. So this is revenge. Elijah shook his head once. No, revenge would require anger. He glanced briefly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan, where streams of rainwater blurred the city into silver streaks and fading light. This is disappointment. The word landed harder than shouting. Claire felt it in her chest immediately because she understood what Elijah meant. He had walked into that room prepared to save them, prepared to trust them with $200 million and the future of his firm's reputation. Then Richard Whitmore had reduced him to a stereotype before hearing him speak. Elijah reached into his jacket slowly and removed his phone. The screen glowed softly against the dim boardroom lighting. He typed one short message. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Then he pressed send. Claire's laptop chimed less than 5 seconds later. Her breath caught instantly. Pending capital transfer canceled. Brooks Capital Holdings had officially withdrawn the emergency funding package. Across the room, Richard's face lost color. "No," he whispered under his breath. Daniel stared at the collapsing stock ticker on his tablet as numbers turned red one after another. 8% down. 11. 14. Phones began vibrating across the conference table almost simultaneously. Legal. Investors. Media. Panic spreading in real time. Elijah slipped his phone back into his pocket calmly. "A company survives on trust," he said quietly. "The moment respect disappears, everything built on top of it starts collapsing too." Then he turned toward the boardroom doors while nobody tried to stop him. The boardroom doors closed softly behind Elijah Brooks, but the sound echoed through the room like the final click of a lock. Nobody spoke for several seconds after he left. The glowing stock ticker on the far wall kept bleeding red beneath the cold chandelier light, while phones vibrated nonstop across the marble table. Richard Whitmore remained standing near the center of the room, staring at the closed doors as though refusing to believe what had just happened. Outside, the rain had finally slowed to a mist drifting over Manhattan, turning the city lights into blurred halos against the dark evening sky. Claire slowly stood from her chair. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the scattered reports from the table. "Richard," she said quietly, "the funding is gone." He did not answer. Another executive checked his phone and exhaled sharply. 3 institutional investors just suspended negotiations. "Legal wants an emergency call in 10 minutes, someone else muttered. Daniel Reyes sat frozen near the end of the table, watching years of corporate confidence collapse in less than 5 minutes. Richard suddenly slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle coffee cups. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. One investor pulls out, and everyone loses their minds. But even his anger sounded uncertain now. Nobody rushed to agree with him anymore. Nobody laughed at his jokes. The room that once moved around Richard Whitmore with automatic obedience had grown painfully still. Claire walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city. 42 floors below, yellow taxi lights drifted through wet streets while steam curled upward from subway grates into the cold night air. New York kept moving no matter who lost power inside expensive buildings. "He was going to save us," she said softly without turning around. Richard looked at her sharply. "Do not start." Claire finally faced him. "You humiliated the man financing our survival before he even sat down." Richard scoffed bitterly. "You are seriously taking his side?" "This is not about sides anymore," Claire answered quietly. "This is about consequences." The words settled heavily into the room. Richard loosened his tie with shaking fingers and sank into his chair for the first time all evening. He suddenly looked older beneath the harsh boardroom lighting. Tired. The confidence that once filled every inch of him now seemed to leak away with every passing minute. Daniel glanced toward the empty chair Elijah had occupied. The untouched glass of water still sat there beside the neatly aligned documents. Calm, organized, controlled. The complete opposite of the chaos left behind after he walked out. Claire lowered herself slowly into the seat across from Richard. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked softly. Richard rubbed his forehead without looking up. "I do not need another lecture right now." "No," Claire whispered. "The worst part is that he never once raised his voice." Silence answered her, because everyone in that room understood what she meant. Elijah had not needed anger to expose them. He had simply remained dignified while they revealed themselves. Another notification flashed across the giant screen mounted on the wall. Whitmore Dynamics stock suspended pending volatility review. One executive quietly cursed beneath his breath. Another immediately began typing messages to outside counsel. Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. "This cannot be happening," he whispered. Claire watched rainwater slide slowly down the glass behind him. "It already happened the moment you decided what kind of man he was before hearing him speak." Richard closed his eyes tightly. For the first time all night, the room finally fell completely silent again. No arguments. No presentations. No confidence. Just the low hum of the building and the distant sound of thunder fading somewhere beyond the city. And sitting alone beneath the cold white lights of the collapsing boardroom, Richard Whitmore finally understood something success had hidden from him for years. Respect lost in one small moment could destroy everything built on top of it. By sunrise the next morning, every major business network in America was talking about Whitmore Dynamics. Headlines rolled across television screens in red banners, while financial analysts dissected the company's collapse in calm professional voices that somehow made everything sound even colder. Emergency funding withdrawn. Investor confidence shaken. Trading halted. Questions surrounding executive leadership. Inside Richard Whitmore's corner office, the television played silently against the far wall, while pale morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The rain was gone now, but the city looked washed out and distant beneath low gray clouds. Richard had not gone home. His tie hung loose around his neck, and untouched coffee sat cold beside stacks of legal documents covering his desk. Every few minutes another call came in. Board members, lawyers, reporters, shareholders demanding explanations. He ignored most of them. Across the office, Claire stood quietly near the windows reading another emergency email on her tablet. "The board wants an emergency vote at noon," she said softly. Richard did not look up. "To remove me." It was not a question. Claire lowered the tablet slowly. "They think it may stabilize investor confidence." Richard laughed once under his breath, exhausted and hollow. Investor confidence. He leaned back in his chair and stared toward the skyline. 23 years building this company, and suddenly, everyone acts like they never trusted me. Claire remained silent because deep down she knew this moment had not started yesterday. It had started years earlier in smaller moments Richard never considered dangerous. The dismissive comments, the assumptions, the belief that status made him better at seeing people than everyone else. Elijah Brooks had simply forced the truth into the open where nobody could ignore it anymore. A knock interrupted the silence. Daniel Reyes stepped carefully into the office carrying a folder against his chest. He looked nervous. "Sir," he said quietly, "Brooks Capital released a statement this morning." Richard held out his hand impatiently. Daniel passed him the paper. The statement was short, professional. No insults, no anger. Brooks Capital Holdings does not enter partnerships where mutual respect and ethical leadership are absent. We wish the employees of Whitmore Dynamics stability during this transition. Richard read the sentence twice, then a third time. His jaw tightened. "Transition," he muttered bitterly. Claire watched him carefully. "He could have humiliated you publicly," she said softly. "He did not." Richard looked up sharply. "You think that makes this better?" "I think it says something about his character." Silence filled the office again. Outside, sunlight finally pushed weakly through the clouds, reflecting across the glass towers of Manhattan like pale, silver fire. Richard loosened his grip on the statement slowly. For the first time since the boardroom meeting, another memory returned to him clearly. Elijah is standing there with his hand extended. Calm, respectful, offering partnership before anything else. Richard closed his eyes briefly. He realized now that Elijah had entered the room prepared to trust him completely. And he had answered that trust with humiliation before hearing a single word the man had to say. The realization sat heavier than the financial disaster unfolding around him. Claire's phone vibrated softly. She checked the screen and inhaled sharply. "The board vote moved up," she whispered. Richard looked at her. She hesitated before speaking again. "It is unanimous." The words seemed to empty the room of air. Richard slowly lowered his eyes toward the city below, while distant traffic drifted upward through 42 floors of glass and steel. For years he had believed leadership meant power, control, dominance. But now, sitting alone in the office he once ruled with absolute confidence, he finally understood something Elijah Brooks had known the entire time. Respect was not a reward for success. It was the foundation beneath it. And once that foundation cracked, everything built on top of it eventually collapsed. 3 days later, the name Whitmore Dynamics had already begun disappearing from Manhattan. Workers in reflective vests stood outside the tower entrance removing the silver company letters one by one, while reporters gathered behind metal barriers along the sidewalk. Cold autumn wind swept between the buildings, carrying the sound of traffic, camera shutters, and distant sirens through the city streets. Above them, the massive glass tower reflected pale afternoon sunlight, like something already fading from memory. Inside the nearly empty executive floor, cardboard boxes lined the hallways where assistants once hurried between meetings carrying tablets and coffee trays. The energy was gone now. No polished confidence. No expensive laughter echoing through marble corridors. Just quiet footsteps and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Richard Whitmore stood alone inside his office, wearing the same dark overcoat he had thrown on that morning without much thought. His desk had been cleared except for one framed photograph of the company's original office from 23 years earlier. Back then he looked younger, hungrier, less certain of his place in the world. Richard stared at the photograph for a long moment before placing it carefully into a box. Then his eyes drifted toward the television mounted silently on the wall. Financial analysts had already moved on to other headlines. The market never stayed emotional for long. But one sentence from Elijah Brooks' public statement still echoed in Richard's mind with painful clarity. Mutual respect and ethical leadership. The words felt heavier now than the billions of dollars discussed in boardrooms over the years. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Claire stepped into the office slowly. "He is downstairs," she said quietly. Richard looked up immediately. "Elijah?" Claire nodded once. "He came to meet with the transition team." Richard looked genuinely surprised for the first time in days. "After everything?" Claire studied her brother carefully before answering. "Some people do not confuse dignity with cruelty." The words settled heavily between them. Richard stared toward the windows overlooking Manhattan, where sunlight reflected across the Hudson River in pale, silver waves. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain walking into a meeting. Not because of contracts or negotiations. Because of shame. Minutes later, the elevator doors opened onto the lobby level with a soft mechanical chime. Elijah Brooks stood near the reception desk speaking calmly with two attorneys while workers carried boxes through the building behind him. He wore another simple charcoal suit, no brighter or more expensive than before. But this time nobody mistook him for someone unimportant. Conversations quieted slightly when he turned. Richard stopped several feet away from him. The massive lobby that once felt powerful now seemed strangely hollow beneath the cold white lighting and towering glass walls. For a moment neither man spoke. Elijah finally looked up. His expression remained calm, though exhaustion sat quietly beneath his eyes. Richard swallowed once before speaking. "I owe you an apology." The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him. Elijah said nothing. Richard glanced briefly toward the workers removing company signs outside the lobby windows. "You were right," he admitted quietly. "About more than the company." Silence stretched gently between them. Then Richard slowly extended his hand. This time there was no arrogance in the gesture. No performance. Just humility stripped raw by consequences. Elijah looked at the hand for several seconds while the city moved beyond the glass behind them. People crossed intersections. Taxi horns echoed faintly through the afternoon air. Life continued. Finally, Elijah reached forward and shook his hand once. Firm. Respectful. Nothing more. Richard exhaled softly as though something heavy had finally loosened inside his chest. Elijah released the handshake calmly. "Money rebuilds companies," he said quietly. "Character rebuilds people." Then he turned toward the elevators again, while Richard remained standing beneath the fading light of the lobby, watching the man he once dismissed walk away with more dignity than anyone else in the building. 2 weeks later, winter air drifted through Manhattan with the sharp, clean bite that arrives just before the holidays. The streets below the financial district glowed with white lights wrapped around bare trees, while steam curled upward from subway grates into the cold evening sky. People hurried through crosswalks, carrying coffee cups and briefcases beneath coats pulled tightly against the wind. And high above the city, on the top floor of a newly renovated office tower overlooking the Hudson River, Elijah Brooks stood quietly beside the window of Brooks Capital Holdings. The office behind him was calm. Warm amber lighting reflected softly against dark wood shelves and polished stone floors, while muted jazz played somewhere in the distance. No shouting, no panic, no desperate meetings pretending confidence still existed. Just quiet professionalism moving steadily through the building. Elijah loosened his tie slightly and watched snow begin to drift across the skyline in slow white flecks. On the desk behind him rested a stack of signed contracts for a new logistics initiative projected to create thousands of jobs across several states. The same industry Whitmore Dynamics once believed it controlled. A soft knock came at the open office door. Daniel Reyes stepped inside carefully, now wearing a Brooks Capital identification badge clipped neatly to his jacket. "The Chicago investors just finalized the partnership agreement," he said with a small smile. Elijah nodded once. "Good. Make sure the employee transition packages go out tonight." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. A lot of former Whitmore employees have been sending thank you messages. Elijah looked back toward the snowy skyline. They deserved stability, he answered. Quietly, Daniel studied him for a moment. Most people would have enjoyed watching Richard Whitmore lose everything after what happened. Elijah's expression remained calm. Watching someone fall teaches you nothing if they never understand why they fell. Silence settled softly through the office. Outside, snowflakes drifted past the glass like pale ash beneath the city lights. Daniel eventually nodded and